Hello, my name is Elizabeth Agnew. Today's date is March 20th, 2018, and I'm interviewing Afrah Ali on the Ball State campus as part of the Virginia B. Ball Center Seminar, Muslims in Muncie. Afrah, thank you for sharing your story with us today. Our goal in this oral history project is to learn about your life and about your contributions towards building a community with fellow Muslims in Muncie, Indiana. I want to begin by asking you where and when you were born.
Yeah, so I was born March 16th, 1998 in Chicago, Illinois.
And can you tell me a little bit about your parents, their names, and a bit about their backgrounds and the work they did?
So my dad's name is Sayed Ali. He was born in Karachi, Pakistan. He came to Chicago early 90s because he wanted to get a job, settle down. And then my mom, her name is Afrah Ali. She was also born in Karachi, Pakistan. She has a biochemistry background. My dad kind of has like a science-y background. And so they got married in 96 in Pakistan, and then they came to Chicago, and that's where I was born 2 years later.
Okay. And you have siblings?
I do.
Right?
Yeah. I have two younger siblings. My brother Moid, he's 17, and then my sister Minha, she's 10.
And I know you live in Indianapolis now, so can you tell me how you came to be in Indianapolis?
Yeah, so when we were living in Chicago, my dad was offered a job in Indiana, and so we moved to LaPorte, Indiana. That's where my brother was born. And then a few years after that, we moved to where we live now, on the south side of Indianapolis.
Can you describe a little bit your experience growing up in this Midwestern city in the early 2000s?
Yeah, I really enjoyed my childhood. It was a really fun time. I think being in Indianapolis, it's more of a diverse community compared to other parts of Indiana. So I grew up in my elementary school, I was definitely the only Muslim Pakistani. But at the same time, I still felt like it was a very open-minded community, and we had a lot of people from different places. We had a lot of African Americans, we had a lot of Hispanics. So it was a really good place to grow up in. Living in the Midwest, it's Indiana. But I've always felt like a Hoosier. So, yeah, I enjoy it.
Tell me about, within your family, how Islam shaped your family's outlook in the Midwest and also practices.
Yeah. So I would say my family, for sure, being the first child, my mom stayed at home for a little bit at the time, and she definitely emphasized all of the Islamic values to us. She gave me these books about the prophets, and she would be very thorough. I had a Syrian Quran teacher, so I finished the entirety of the Quran when I was 7. And there's an event called an Ameen. When you finish the Quran, they just it's kind of like a bar mitzvah, wow, you did it. And so that was a really big thing. She would always take me to this Quran teacher. We had Sunday school every Sunday. I would say that's where I learned a lot about practice. There were a couple of things, that's how we mostly learned how to pray in Sunday school. And so my parents, they would be oh, can you show me the prayers? But it was all from the teacher at Sunday school. So I would say Islam definitely shaped my family a lot. The way we celebrated holidays at the mosque. I grew up in a lot of different mosques, so I experienced that. A lot of cultural things, a lot of values. We had a lot of Muslim friends. We specifically had a lot of South Asian friends. And so my weekends were basically dedicated to them and going to their houses and learning more about them.
So you mentioned Islamic values. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little more in specific terms about some of those that shaped you or that really
I guess you? I think the biggest thing with at least my dad specifically always really mentioned intention. There's a really big value in Islam, I think most religion, about intentions. And so he would always say, for instance, when you pray, when you make wudu, the big thing is to be mindful of what you're doing. That's kind of the reason why people do ablution beforehand, because it's not more about physically being clean. It's about being in the mindset of I'm going to make prayer, so here's my intention to do so. Or fasting, obviously as a child, not eating or drinking anything sounds terrible. But then he explained the intentionality behind it, and I think that was always really ingrained in my family. For instance, being in America, a lot of I don't wear a hijab, and my parents they come from a Muslim majority country, but not as conservative as some of the other ones. So that was always a big thing to not compare yourself to other people at the mosque and just know why you're there. So I think that was always something they really tried to portray.
You'd also mentioned learning cultural things by spending time with the South Asians. What stands out for you in your memory
Oh yeah.
about that?
Definitely the dressing. I had a lot of Pakistani clothes. Like when I was younger, my aunt would always come from Pakistan, and she would bring two suitcases. One like that was for her, and one that was like clothes, like for my mom, for my sister, for me. Like that was such a big deal. Like we would just like go through it and like debate like who would get what clothing. And like a lot of like for Eid, the holiday, there's like a big thing to wear new clothes. So we'd always be like, these are Eid clothes. And then like we would just it was funny though because like all of my neighbors were definitely they were non-Muslim, and so like we would like go and like pile into the minivan when we had to go to like a dinner party, all just be wearing like our Pakistani clothes, and like my neighbors would ask about that, and so I always associated like clothing with Pakistan, and then also the food. Definitely like growing up, we had a lot of. My mom only cooks Pakistani food. Like we didn't go to a restaurant until I was in like middle school because like she just cooked Pakistani food and it wasn't yeah, other than that, like I think another thing too with like your elderly was a really big thing in my household. Like when my grandparents visited, that was a big deal. It was like an event. Like they would come and we would have to like make sure that we served them tea like 3 times a day. So that was such a big deal. And I always had to make sure that I like said salam to them every morning. I said goodnight to them every night. Like I had to make sure I was really respectful. So
I want to follow up on one other thing. You talked about learning the Quran from a Syrian teacher, and that you had read it or learned it by the age you were 7.
Yeah.
Is that common?
I don't know. I think actually when I was younger, so the reason I went to that teacher was because we had a family friend who was my age as well, and she went to this teacher, and she was very insistent that like kids learn the Quran when they're young. So like learn the Arabic alphabet. Obviously, I didn't know what I was reading. So like in Sunday school, what we would do is we would go through chapters of the Quran and like kind of decipher the meaning. But like at that point, I'd already read like all of the surahs, so it was just a matter of like going back through and like knowing some of the meanings. So they really emphasize that and like with memorization, because like when I was reading it with my Syrian teacher, it was just like you're reading it and we need to like make sure that you can say it well. But then later on, it was like let's memorize some verses. So when you pray, you can actually say them and know what they mean. But I guess 7 is kind of young. Maybe people now, I think it's harder. For instance, like my sister, she does an online class. She has an Egyptian Skype teacher, so she'll call her every night and do like a 30-minute Quran session. But like for me, I definitely went to like this lady's house and she like sat me down and like was able to show me.
And was she a Hafiza?
I think so. I think so.
So I have one more question just about your family. What is your sense of how your family identified, maybe as a child and now, in terms of ethnicity, nationality, religion, combination?
I think my parents have always emphasized that first and foremost we're Muslim. That's always a really big thing in my household. Like don't forget that. Like if we go somewhere where like for instance like the mosque that I go to is a little more divided culturally. So there's always instances where it's like remember we're all Muslim, like no matter because sometimes my sister being 10, she gets confused and she thinks that like wearing Pakistani clothes are like Muslim clothes or like Pakistani food is like Muslim food. Like she doesn't make that distinction. But then I think for sure my dad, he very strongly relies on his Pakistani like culture and background. He still watches Geo News, which is Pakistani national news. It's terrible, but he'll sit there and watch it every night. And he was really into cricket. He definitely watches cricket like all the time. But my mom, a little less so. I think my mom, we don't visit Pakistan. We don't have any family there really. So we don't really have like a reason to. But she's very much like, I came to America for a better life. I kind of want to forget about the one I had before. So she definitely wants us to remember like the language and the clothing and the food. But it's not as prevalent as it is like to my dad.
Do you speak Urdu?
I do. Being the first child, I think I didn't know English until like preschool, but then like, you catch on so fast. But I definitely now, like when I speak Urdu, I feel like it's with like an American accent, which is kind of unfortunate. So I'm trying to work on that, but like my sister doesn't know like anything. Like if you say stuff to her, she can kind of register, but like not really. Like I can speak it and I can really understand it, but my brother can a little bit more, but not as much.
So within this family context and living in the Midwest, Did you or do you recall having experienced any discrimination as a child in the community or at school with your peers?
Hmm. I think as a child, up until middle school, no. Like actually, when I was in elementary school, people were like really welcoming. I had a specific teacher in third grade who like was very into like different cultures and different religions. And I remember she like had me present about Ramadan and like she made us like bring in like samosas and dates for people to like break their fast and like to explain because I really was the for like all of my pre-college education, I was definitely like the token Muslim student in a lot of regards, and so was like my brother. But really, we had to like represent. And so until I got to middle school, it was just kids being like really dumb. Like I remember when Osama bin Laden was assassinated. This kid at school, he asked me like why I was at school, and I was like, why would I not be at school? And he was like, well, your uncle died, like something like that. And there was also like another instance like in middle school, like I used to always bring like my mom's like leftover food, and like this kid told me that my food smelled really foreign. But like obviously it's foreign food. But like the way he said it had such a negative connotation that I was like, oh no, like I think garlic is terrible. So then I had my mom like make me make like peanut butter sandwiches every day. Like from the rest of my life, I was like, I cannot smell foreign. I cannot be associated. Like it was bad. But just I think it was actually more being embarrassed about being Pakistani. Like first I was like a brown kid. Then people realized I was a Muslim brown kid. So like it just kind of piled up. But like they really didn't bother me about it. Like certain things, like for instance, like with dating or with eating pork, like people just knew. They're like, that's Afra's thing. Like, you know, that's who she is. So
What stands out to you about high school?
high school, I think people genuinely wanted to learn. I actually had an instance with the teacher, a substitute teacher who I was at study hall and he was going through roll call and my name was first. And so I thought he was interested in where I was from because he was like, wow, your name sounds really neat. Can you tell me about your family? So I was like, yeah, my family's Pakistani. And he said, I'm so sorry. And I was like, I don't really know. I didn't know how to react. Because like at that point in my life, I was just like embracing like all those parts of me that I was really confused about. And then this man had to like feel bad for me that I was from. I was like, I'm actually proud of my culture now. And thank you for, you know, saying that. So it was interesting to like kind of step back and be like, to wonder what people thought, especially when things started getting political in high school, with you know all of the worldly events like kind of resurfacing more so. So it was interesting to kind of deal with.
What year did you start high school?
I want to say 2012 because I graduated 2016.
Okay. Mm. So you're a sophomore at Ball State now. How did you decide to come to Ball State?
So Ball State, I knew from the beginning that I wanted to pursue social work. And so that was like my main thing. I really thought I was going to end up at IU Bloomington. I was really convinced. Like all of my family friends, they were like, you have to go to IU because everybody we know goes to IU. No one's ever heard of Muncie. No one's ever heard of Ball State. And so I was like, I just really want to do social work. And so what happened was actually I had a scholarship interview for here and I got the scholarship. And so I was like, well, I would be really dumb to not take it. So I kind of came to Ball State for like financial reasons, but then I ended up really liking it. So we're here.
What have been the best aspects of being here for the last year and a half?
Yeah, I think definitely like the Ball State community. At first, I was really confused because I was like, it's Muncie, like it's just Muncie, you know? But like, it's always about the people that make a place better. Like, it's not Muncie's gonna be Muncie. But I've met some really great people, some really great professors, had some cool opportunities like this. So that's been really fun.
Mm-hmm. Have you faced any challenges here? Just academic challenges or challenges as a Muslim student in a minority?
I would say as a Muslim student, that was my biggest concern coming to Ball State. Actually, I should say my mom's biggest concern because when I was choosing a roommate, freshman year, she was like, you need to make sure to like request a Muslim roommate or like a South Asian roommate or like a Middle Eastern roommate so they'll be more understanding. And it was interesting though because I talked to somebody about it, like some authority here, and they were like, well, that's kind of like discriminatory if you were to like pursue that. I was like, yeah, that makes sense. So what happened was my current roommate, Macy, we met at orientation and it was fine. And then I was gonna go random. I was like, it doesn't really matter. But then Macy like messaged me on Facebook and she was like, I remember you from orientation. Do you want to be roommates? And I remember I specifically asked her, I was like, hey, I'm Muslim if this bothers you, because like I'll be praying in the room. let me know. And she was like, why would that bother me? So I was like, Mom, see, she's nice. And so the only instance I could think of was like when the 2016 election happened. I was like kind of on edge. I was like, but it's a college campus, so I didn't expect like any like reaction or something. And I think a lot of people in college, I'm like the first Muslim they've met or have befriended. And so a lot of people don't even know that I'm Muslim. They like ask me a lot about being Pakistani, but usually not about my religion. And so it was interesting. And especially now this year, I've been more involved with like the Islamic Center of Muncie because I had a car, so I was able to visit. I was involved in the Muslim Student Association. I still am, but more so last year. So it was good. It was definitely welcoming, which was good.
Tell me a little bit about the Muslim Student Association, your role in it, but also your sense of its presence on campus and the goals it has.
Yeah. So freshman year, that was actually one of the things that I was like insistent that I joined because I'd heard about other universities having a Muslim Student Association. So when I went to the activity fair, I looked for their booth and they didn't have one. And so I remember I saw like, I Googled it and their website was like so outdated. It was like from 2007. I was like, huh. So I saw a phone number at the bottom of it and I like texted it and then someone finally got back to me and they said, oh, we're having a call-out meeting. So I actually went with my friend Jay, who's an atheist, and we showed up at like the bottom of Bracken and there was like 3 guys in there and they like started doing this PowerPoint presentation about Islam. And we walked in and they were like shocked. They were like, females, what's happening? And I was like, hi, I'm Afrah, I'm a freshman. And all of them are a lot older. And so they were really welcoming. And basically they decided we were gonna have meetings, but our main event is Islamic Awareness Week. And so I was able to like help with that. I made the poster board. We had a hijab day that I got to help with. So I like advertised it to people. Like if we had a meeting, I was like, please come. We really want like not just Muslims to be here. It's kind of for everybody. But our membership is very low. And for reasons that I'm now understanding, but like before, like I've like interacted with like the Saudi Student Association. I think there is an Indian Student Association. I haven't really met any of them. There's an Asian American Student Association. But in terms of like the Muslim Student Association, it's very small. They try, I think, as much as they can. But yeah, the presence I wouldn't say is very large. We've discussed like how to make it larger or more apparent, but that's like having a small group, like the lack of funding and the lack of organization. So hopefully it'll be better. But I'm on technically their executive board. So yeah, that's my position.
You mentioned the membership was low, and you said you thought you had a sense of why that might be.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So Anas, the first person I met who I contacted, he's from Saudi Arabia. And so I was asking him, I was like, oh, there's a Saudi Student Association. Why don't we ask them to join the Muslim Student Association? And he was like, I've tried before. They used to be. They don't anymore. There's a lot of governmental conflict. And so by hearing that, I was kind of like, okay, but they definitely have a larger scale of events. So it was really interesting to me as to why they weren't a part of ours. And I would try, like if I saw like a woman like wearing a burqa, I would introduce myself. They were all like PhD students. They just weren't interested in being part of like a student organization. So, I mean, like we tried to like recruit kind of like not just Muslims, but just like anyone. But like it would be nice to have a Muslim presence, but we just really couldn't get one.
So do you see any part of that as ethnic tensions? Or might you have social connections with these people outside of formal club arrangements?
Yeah, I think the ethnic tension is definitely like kind of what Anas was talking about. Is definitely their own issue. Like a lot of people, when you say Saudis, they're like, oh, sometimes get a bad taste in their mouth because they think that their version of Islam is like their own version of Islam. So like to have that in a club would be spreading that we're more of like a Saudi Islamic club, something of that sort, which is not what we were going for. But yeah, I don't know about like in other situations, like when I go to like Friday prayer, we all get along. I see them. If I run into them on campus, I try to say hi. But in terms of like meeting like as like a group to do something about it, we don't.
I wanted to follow up on the point you made about Hijab Day, the MSA. What is that and how is that received on the campus?
Yeah, so we had a try on Hijab Day. So basically, two ladies from the mosque came and they had this like array of scarves on a table. And so like any girl could like come up if you wanted to like pay for a scarf. I think it was like $5. But basically you could try one on, you could take a picture. I don't wear a hijab. So we also explained how like people portray Islam in a different way in like their daily life. it was a good conversation. There was actually a lady from Saudi Arabia who wore like a niqab and a burqa. This other lady just wore a headscarf. This other lady had more of a turban style. So it was a good conversation to have. We also had two guys try on a hijab. That was interesting. They just came up and were like, how about we do it? And we were like, that's okay. But we also kind of explained like the hijab in terms, because men technically have a hijab. It's not like the full-on headscarf, but like it's there. So that was fun.
I have one other question about the MSA.
Mm-hmm.
In the last couple of years, members have had discussions with administrators about a designated prayer space for Muslims on campus. I'm wondering what your sense of that is, and whether you think that's an important goal for the MSA to pursue and successfully pursue,
Right.
which they haven't yet.
That would be fantastic. I asked about it when we were at a meeting because one of my neighbors was on Student Government Association, and she asked me my opinion because that was actually on their agenda for a while. I think it was actually one of the top priorities was to get a prayer space on campus, not just for Muslims, but like an inclusive space for like all religions, because we have a very Christian-dominated campus, and there's a lot of churches that are very nearby, a lot of groups that are very present. And so to be more inclusive of other groups, they were saying that it would be really nice to have a prayer space, and they used to have one. I don't know, I think it was at the Student Center, but they were talking about making a space in the library because it's very central, but I don't know why it didn't get passed. I mean, my opinion was that we should do it, and I know other people spoke about it too. And like the Islamic Center is not too far away, but for like a student, it's very convenient to, pray on campus. Obviously, I have like my dorm room, and if that was too loud, my hall director actually told me that I could use like one of our lobby rooms. Sometimes I would reserve a room in the library, like if it was like that loud. But I mean, we accommodate as much as we can.
So you've mentioned the Islamic Center of Muncie a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Do you go there for Juma prayer or for other social events?
Yeah, so this year was the first year I could go. I love that place. I tried to go for every Friday prayer because my classes ended early that day. And then also, I went to a couple monthly dinners when they had them. I'm definitely on the email list, so I'm aware of like any of the events they're having. But other than that, the Bahrami family, they've invited me to their house a couple times for dinner. So to like be more involved in the community and to actually see it is really nice. Because I remember before I got here, I was completely unaware. I was like, there's no Muslims in Muncie at all. And so someone told me how there's like a really strong Arab population of Muslims, which I am not that familiar with because like my family being Pakistani, we kind of only associate with Pakistanis and Indians. So it was a really like nice change of pace. Like I'm definitely the only Pakistani at the mosque that I'm aware of. So like going there, I was like, no one's actually kind of like me. Like we are obviously because we're all here. But that was definitely like a good perspective to have.
So your sense is that this is a very diverse mosque.
Mm-hmm.
And can you say a little bit more about that? What's your perception of
Yeah, I think, also being a small community, it's such a diverse mosque in terms of how many different cultures there are, how many different backgrounds there are, even age groups. Like it's not, even though it's a college campus, it's not just students. There's actually a pretty dominant community within itself. And they're so welcoming. And I think not that other mosques aren't, but the way they, especially like Sister Bibi, she was the first person I met when I went to the mosque, and she immediately like gave me a whole tour of the place. She was like, oh, by the way, I know a couple Pakistani guys. And I was like, okay. But she was very, she was very friendly. And to like see a female so present in the community, because that's when she was elected president the year I met her. And so she was like going around. I remember one particular instance where they had these paintings on the wall. And Sister Bibi was talking about how since she's the president, she was just going to start rearranging everything. And we were like, okay. So me, her, and actually Sarah Hedgeco, she took off the painting, and I remember distinctly she ripped out the nail, and like conveniently she had a hammer like in her purse, and she just like re-nailed it without, we asked her, we were like, should we measure something? Should we scale something? Should we get like that wood scanner to make sure we're not, messing up the interior of the mosque? And she was like, oh, I can do this. And so she just nailed it, she put it in, it was crooked, so she tried it again a couple times, and then it was there, and I was like, this is the mosque. It was really nice. And of course her husband was waiting in the car. So it was a really good perspective to have. And definitely the dinners are a lot of fun. A lot of good food.
So you tell a story about Bibi and nailing a picture on the wall, but are there other things that are distinctive, that you sense are distinctive about her leadership as the first woman leader of the mosque?
I think just the fact that she's so open, and I think there's a big thing sometimes about females wanting to be presented as less open in a way, or in terms of like friendliness. Like for instance, like she's very like she'll hug anybody and everybody, which not that everyone doesn't, but that's like a very big thing to be that welcoming, I think at least. And I haven't seen that before, especially in a female role. And the fact that I think one time she even said to me, like things would be a lot better if women just were in charge. And I was like, you're right, Sister Bibi. But it's interesting too. It's also good to see how like supportive her family is of it, because that's another thing too. I think sometimes people get a rep of like only listening to their husbands or what they have to say. But obviously Sabra Barami is very supportive. In fact, like Sister Bibi probably like yeah, she really upholds like their family, and he mentions it a lot too. So it's really nice to see. And she's just like a great role model for everybody, not just the females in the community, but for everyone. And she talks a lot about the future generation. She's someone that I know a lot of like kids look up to, and they're like, we all know Bibi. So
I wondered about that. To what extent are women of your generation involved in leadership at the mosque?
not not involved. I mean definitely less women come. And so I've met a couple like transfer students who are my age, and a lot of them they come because their families come. And so they're there for prayer. Sometimes we'll like they a lot of them live in like the Anthony apartments. We'll talk about like maybe visiting. A lot of them though they live with like their brothers or like a cousin or someone from like out of the country. So they're very like they're here because someone has brought them, which is okay, like fine. But they don't want to be involved. Like I'll tell them about the MSA. They don't really want to be involved. They're here for their studies. That's really it. So I think they definitely like enjoy the mosque and like the dinners, and they always help with like all the food at the dinners. But other than that, it's kind of like it's more for I'm pretty sure it's the same as it is back home for them. Like the mosque is there to pray. That's kind of it.
Mm-hmm. How would you describe the practice of gender separation at this masjid, and how might you compare that to your home masjid?
So I know this mosque has, at least in the prayer area, a one-sided glass. At my mosque, they have that as well, except in our mosque, it was a very new addition. Our mosque, the executive board are 5 males, one of whom used to be my dad. They're all South Asian. They're all mid-40s, 50s, very similar viewpoints that are kind of traditional. And so they have a women's area. And at my mosque, no AC. It used to not have AC. It used to not have a speaker system. They updated the men's wudu area, not the women's. The women have to do wudu in a sink. So they finally actually recently got a female board member. I don't know how much say she has, but it was interesting though because a lot of people were making calls about like how the women should be acting. Like for instance, like during Ramadan, the nightly prayers, which last like midnight, 1 a.m. during the summer, all like the kids, if the women had to bring their kids, they would be screaming because it was really late at night. And like the men would make an announcement on the microphone like, hey, mothers, please watch your children. And I remember there was like a mom who like gave her husband their son because she was like, you're just as much in charge. And so it was like, there's no AC here. We can't hear anything that's going on. So could you please like fix that? And so slowly, I think they've been trying to understand because they're obviously, if it's a one-sided glass, they're very unaware of how many females are there. And during Ramadan, there's like a decent amount, and we have to use the back door, which isn't a big deal. It actually, I think to a lot of people, the reason they do that is because a lot of women are more comfortable with that. Like I'll walk through the front door and like no one says anything. But I think more people really are comfortable with like just like adjusting their headscarf in the back in the separated area. But because of that, they do have functions because it is an Islamic center, the one I go to. So they kind of have like a banquet area, not in the basement, it's like right next to the prayer area. And so the woman will like help with the food. They'll have food for both sides instead of the sides like having to share. And so that's okay. The gender separation though is definitely very present. I think at this mosque it is as well, but they're definitely not as, it seems like adamant about certain things. Like I think if a female were to walk into the front door here, I don't think it'd be a big deal. At dinners, people definitely sit together if they want to, which is nice. But I know people are obviously respectful and they don't like make it a point to like really mingle with the opposite gender. But they still there's not that at my mosque they don't respect each other, but I think here it's more friendly. Mm-hmm. Like it's not as much of a big deal. And they definitely have a nice speakers. The women's area is really nice, so that's a good thing. They accommodate well.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of obstacles that are present or are faced by the current Islamic Center here in Muncie?
In terms of Just anything?
Yeah, either around that issue or just more broadly.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of is just like they talk a lot about exterior fundraising. So like when I was there, I remember I always had to show up really early because the parking is awful on Fridays. So they always talk about expanding. They have like a lot nearby that they want to take over, which is nice to hear because it really shows that there's a community that wants to expand. But that kind of thing, I know they talk about like, for instance, like there was like the heater system was broken, something like that. So very like, but in terms of like the community having their own obstacles, I'm unaware of. Just like being a student, being not as involved, I would say. But
Looking beyond the Islamic Center of Muncie, have you been involved in programs sponsored by two prominent Indianapolis-based Muslim organizations? One of them is the Muslim Alliance of Indiana, and then the other is Islamic Society of North America, ISNA.
Yeah, so ISNA is very special to me. MAI, I don't know a lot about. I think they have sponsored events that I've been to, but I actually didn't know a lot about them until our class. But ISNA's known for being the place where people go to for Eid because it's so big. And so there was a big thing where ISNA used to be the only place that held Eid prayer, like in basically all of Indiana, at least like the central part. So people would come from the north side, from the south side, just like everyone. It would be super crowded. Like the men would take over the entire first floor. The woman had the basement, the balcony. All the kids were everywhere. It was really fun though. And that was like a big thing. Like we're going to ISNA for Eid. There's donuts there. That was such a big deal. And I got to like my friends who live in Fishers, that was like the only time of year I got to see them. And then later on, ISNA also has like potlucks for like Ramadan. They have a lot of fundraisers because it's a lot to keep up with. But then the Al-Huda, they started doing an Eid prayer, so a lot of people for convenience went to Al-Huda for prayer instead. So that became kind of, not a divide, like that was fine because people understood. Then the Carmel Masjid, I don't recall the name, but they held an Eid prayer that was like, I think either at a school or a convention center recently. And that caused a little bit of tension because people were like, if we have 3 massive locations to pray, we don't want to like divide people up in terms, because like Eid prayer is a very big thing where everybody's just here for Eid. Eid, we're breaking our fast. It's a time to celebrate. It's like Muslim Christmas. And so to have that kind of divided, I know people were very weary of. Like now, I don't really know what they do because we don't really, I see the north side people, like people have a lot of Eid parties. So like it'll be Eid prayer and then like we just go to like house after house after house. So I still see them, but like in terms of prayer, they're not. Like, it's not the size of people at prayer has definitely shrunk, which is nice because there's more space, but also it's different. So, yeah, that's how I've been involved in ISNA. Also, ISNA does a lot of youth programs. There's a group called MINA, which is like Muslim Youth of North America. They used to have like summer camps. I never went because it's pretty pricey to go. But sometimes if ISNA like held like a personal program, my mom would be like, you should do this and send me off. But they're really involved, I think, in the youth. They have their own Sunday school in Plainfield. There, I knew a lot of people from Plainfield when I was growing up, but I would say ISNA, like I definitely associate really well with ISNA.
I want to ask you just some questions about your own practice of Islam. First, I'm wondering how you would characterize your practice of Islam.
That's an interesting question. I feel like I still falter with that because like obviously everybody I think in their religion tries to improve as much as they can daily. Like I would not say I'm like the most religious person because I don't even know what that means, but I try to like know as much as I can. So when I was younger, it was all about just like following the rules. Like I ate halal, I dressed modestly. That's what it took to be Muslim. But now, like looking into it, there's also like a spiritual side, I would say, like again with the intentionality. And so I really try at this point now, since I'm older, to understand meaning. So like before, I would just read the Qur'an in Arabic. I had no idea what it meant. Then I would memorize certain passages because you kind of have to for prayer. But now I can like, I've read the Qur'an fully in English and I can like look back at certain surahs, like I'll read them side by side in Arabic and English. So I can feel like I actually like know what I'm reading, which is really important to me. And also, I don't really listen to a lot of like Muslim scholars. I want to, I don't really know which ones I should. A lot of Muslim like scholarly readings I haven't really investigated into, but I'm definitely interested in. And so just to like be expansive, I've also, with religion, I think I try more so in college to learn about different religions because it's more present to me. When I was younger, like I remember I asked my mom if I could go to like my friend's church. She said it was fine, but I could tell that she didn't really like she was weary of it. But now in college, like I've been to a couple services, I've been to a mass. I haven't been to a synagogue yet. I would love to. But that kind of thing, just to, not to like feel more secure in my own religion, but just to like know where I'm coming from, what the differences are. For MSA, I had to go to an interfaith luncheon, and it was all Christian organizations. We were the MSA. There was one like Hindu organization kind of, I think, but like they didn't have a lot of vegetarian options at the luncheon. So the guy who was there left. And so it was just me at this table, and I had to the reason I was there was because our president at the time couldn't be there, so he was like, why don't you sub in for me? And this was like September of my freshman year of college. I had no idea what was going on. I'd been to 2 MSA meetings. So I was there like representing the Muslim population of Ball State. But yeah, that was a lot. But I think because of that, I don't feel like I have to uphold being a good Muslim, because to people, but like obviously the way I act, if I'm the only Muslim, people know that that's what they're going to associate with. I've like in high school, a lot of the times if something happened on on television, like some sort of terrorist attack, we would talk about it, and then people would be like, oh, well, Afra's not like that because we know that she's nice and she's a Muslim. So like, not that that was like any pressure, because it's not that I was being nice so I could uphold some title for everyone. But it's interesting to like have that perspective and be like, wow, people are looking at how I practice my religion. Like, I need to make sure that they know I'm fasting, I guess. Or like, do they know I pray? Do they know that I dress this way? So, yeah. But I would say religion is important to me in my daily life.
Yeah. You mentioned dress.
Mm-hmm.
Would you be willing to talk about your choices around hijab?
Yeah, I can talk a lot about that. But, so I've struggled. In terms of like the word jihad, internal struggle, I would say hijab is definitely mine, because hijab is known to be very interpretational to some people. Some people, it's very a black and white thing, like you have to be wearing hijab. When I was younger, my mom definitely emphasized covering up certain parts of your body. So for me, I always make sure my legs are fully clothed. Sometimes I wear like shorter sleeves, but as I get older, I'm more conscious of it. It's really interesting because I didn't see the shift, but like in the summer, I wear like a lot of like loose cotton shirts. But like it's not that I like am against like showing my elbows, but it's just an interesting perspective to have. And so now, like as I get older, I'm very conscious of certain fashion choices. Like they have like those loose flowing pants. I'm like, wow, that was made for me. Like I have to make sure I can wear those. It's like it gets me really excited. Actually, one of my friends, it used to be a lot easier for me to say that I was vegetarian. And so she had this joke where one time we went to shop for prom dresses, and the lady was asking me like what I needed, and my friend was like, make sure that she gets one with sleeves. And the lady was like, well, why? And she was like, well, Afra's a vegetarian. And so we just like had this joke about it where I was like, this is just how you can explain things to people, because like they kind of won't get it. So to me, like modesty was always in the heart and your actions. And so I try to reflect that. And if it comes to one day wearing the hijab and like being very open about it, I hope so. But for now, it's kind of like I try my best to dress a certain way and to present myself a certain way and hope that's good enough.
So I want to turn to ask you about living here in Muncie. I know you mentioned that earlier, but could you describe your impressions of being in Muncie, or of Muncie as a city?
Mm-hmm. So I think first coming to Ball State, I remember I thought campus was huge. I am very directionally challenged. So I got lost everywhere. But then eventually, like, the campus isn't too big. So it became a matter of, like, let's explore Muncie, like my friends and I. So we went to downtown. We realized it was a street. Pretty nice. We also, but then we went to, like, Minnetrista, the farmer's market. That was really nice. Everything is on McGalliard. So it was pretty convenient. But other than that, I mean, Muncie reminded me a lot of where I grew up, like, in terms of, like, suburban area. So that wasn't new, but it never felt like a college city to me, like kind of like that college experience that people talk about. I wasn't really here for like a college experience. But at the same time, like for instance, like I visit my friend at IU, and like Bloomington has a really nice downtown area. They have a lake, they have woods. You know, it's very pretty. There's a lot to do. And so that was kind of my first impression of Muncie, that it was kind of just like boring. But I think that's changed being a Ball State student, because like you get more involved with campus. I've been to a lot of like shows and musicals, so like that kind of aspect I really like. And so like as I get older, I realize that there's like more things to do here, or like more involved. So that's been nice.
In what ways have you been engaged in community organizations and activities?
Yeah, so joining the MSA, one of the things I'm involved in. I would say the biggest thing I'm involved in is a program called College Mentors for Kids. So it's an organization that a lot of the Muncie population, we recruit kids who are in more low-income families or at risk for whatever reason. And so the program is completely free to them. Once a week, they come to campus from the hours of 3 to 5, and we give them snack, we do an activity, they do journals and reflections. So my little buddy, Alexis, she was in second grade last year, so we met every Wednesday. It was like the highlight of my week. And so loving the organization so much, I continued being Alexis's mentor. But also on Tuesdays, I'm a general manager, so I have a fourth grade class, and I get to kind of be a teacher. Like each kid is paired with their own mentor, so I'm in charge of the mentor and their little buddy. And so I kind of like run the classroom a little bit. I have a classroom of 30, which I was not expecting to have. It's like the largest one, but they're really nice. They call me Miss Afrah. It's really cute. And then I used to be more involved with the Honors College. I wrote for their newsletter. Not so much anymore this year. I used to also work for Woodworth Dining. I was a barista, but that's passed. So yeah, that's how I'm involved on campus. In terms of community organizations, I also used to volunteer at A Better Way, which is a domestic violence shelter and crisis center. It was mostly for my social work experience. It was definitely really intense. It was last semester. It was more intense than I thought it would be, but it was an eye-opener. And so hopefully I can actually do like an internship with them later on, but at the time it was a lot. And that's the way I think I learned more about the Muncie community rather than the Ball State community.
So volunteering for College Mentors for Kids seems like it might present a wonderful opportunity to share with the children your background as a Muslim.
Yeah.
Do you do that?
That's actually really funny because we had an activity last semester. It was a Brave Space activity. So it's like by choice, you get to kind of like participate in the activity. And so what happened was we had someone leading it, and we were all in a circle, and you had to get in the middle. Like they would say a question, and you would have to get in the middle if it pertained to you. And so like it wasn't, because obviously these are like 9-year-olds, so the questions weren't anything crazy, but it was like, are you from a divorced family? And someone would step in. And so I remember one time it was like, are you Christian? And a couple of kids were like, I guess I go to church. So they just kind of stepped in the middle. And then one of them was like, are you a Muslim? And so I was the only one who like stepped in the middle, and they were like, what is that? And so I kind of explained, I was like, oh, it's like a different religion. And we do a lot of diversity activities. And so like the kids obviously don't know a lot about Islam. I'm sure they don't hear about it from like their schools or their parents. But it was really funny. And like I've definitely explained that I'm like Pakistani, which like they don't know what that means. Like I'll pull up a map and be like, this is where it is. But that's kind of, I think they're interested in it, but they're definitely kind of like, oh, okay, which is nice to hear from children. Because I remember that when I was growing up, like it was just like, oh, that's cool. And then that's kind of it. Like you're still like just a person to them. Like that, there's no prejudice or like judgment being made because you're just kids. So they are kind of like, okay, that's cool. And they kind of move on.
So you mentioned saying something to them, oh, that's a different religion.
Yeah.
Beyond that, what in substance have you shared with them about Islam, or have you?
Yeah, I think one time we talked about fasting because they were like, what are your plans for the summer? I was like, well, Ramadan. And so I would explain, what fasting is, and they're like, that sounds awful. I was like, well, sometimes. But so other than that, I think when we talked about like Christmas time, because like there's like a big thing now in schools, you can't say we're having a Christmas party. It's like a winter party. And so we like had to explain like different traditions that go on, like Hanukkah. And they were like, oh, Afra, what do you do? And I kind of explained Muslim Christmas. But other than that, they're kind of like, I think they're like, okay. I don't know if they like go home and are like, Mom, my general manager is a Muslim. I don't know if they say that. I don't know if they say I'm Pakistani. I don't know how some certain parents would react to that. But yeah, other than that, I hope they're okay with it.
So you mentioned emphasizing to them being Pakistani. For yourself, is that the way you would think of your identity as Pakistani, maybe first, or Muslim, or is that just has to do with how you're presenting yourself to people?
I would say Muslim American more so than Pakistani. I think actually I probably associate least with Pakistani. That's probably like the newest aspect of my like identity that I'm trying to like figure out. Because it's interesting when you think about like later on, if I were to have my own family, how would I present Urdu? Would I speak to them in Urdu? Because that would mean I need to improve my Urdu. Would I marry a Pakistani just to like make sure that like tradition follows? Would I cook Pakistani food? would I make sure to like be very inclusive of other cultures? Because like I do see myself, I am American, but in a lot of the ways I think I go about my day, I'm more American than Pakistani. And so in terms of religion, I think that's also interesting because to me, religion is very much so a lifestyle. And so to like get to that point though, where your religion is a lifestyle, where like I'm incorporating my life into Islam rather than vice versa, that's obviously a lifetime struggle. But to deal with that, it's like now in my life I can easily identify as Muslim. Before I was kind of like, if you ask me about it, I'll tell you. Now if people are like, name a fun fact about yourself, and I'm like, I'm Muslim. Or like, my parents are Pakistani. But before I was like, yes, I'm tan, don't look at that. Like, it wasn't something that I was proud of, that's for sure. So like now I'm proud of it so I can express it. But before, definitely not. So.
So you mentioned being an American, and I wanted to turn and talk to you a little bit about your experience of being a Muslim in America in light of national and international events. You were about 3 years old when 9/11 occurred. Are you aware of how that event changed your family's life at that time, and maybe in the years immediately after that?
For sure. So when 9/11 happened, my family, I was 3, my brother was 1. I think actually though at the time, I think my dad still had his job in Chicago because I remember we moved to LaPorte so he could get this job opportunity, but I think he was still transitioning. So my mom was like in a LaPorte apartment with my brother and I. And I think she told me that her brother at the time, he lived in Florida. He called her, said, hey, turn on the news. And that's when she saw what was happening. My dad actually, and we lived like, when I say Chicago, like we lived in like, on like Lakeshore Drive, like Chicago. And so we lived in like a really worn down apartment, like in an alley. Like it's like now that we drive by it, I'm like, why did we live there? But I remember he told me when 9/11 happened, we had a lot of neighbors who were Sikhs. And a lot of them owned gas stations, or my dad also worked at a grocery store part-time. And so a lot of them were like the cashiers. And he said that the Sikhs who wore turbans got a lot of threats. And my dad was always kind of, sometimes I think people thought he was like Hispanic. So it wasn't really, like nothing was really aimed at him. He's like talked about before, like his neighbors, like their windows being shot at or something like that. I don't know necessarily like as a hate crime or just in general because like the area was kind of bad. But he definitely, I mean, that wasn't the sole reason we left, but like I'm sure that helped, like not wanting to be there. But I would say for sure, for my parents, I think maybe it gave my dad a perspective on America. Like he's definitely not a conspiracy theorist, but if you were to get him hooked on Bush did 9/11, I'm sure he would follow. Like like if you were like, here's some evidence, he'd be like, that's what it is. Like, but my mom, much so, is kind of like she wants to just kind of like forget about it. And so like I remember distinctly when I was a freshman in high school, the Boston bombing marathon happened. The bombing. And so I was in class. It was my world history class. That teacher was very open. He had a religious studies background. So he always talked to me about like being Muslim, what that meant, a lot of like the history of it. And so the bombing happened while we were in school. And so I remember we were like watching the reactions on TV. It was something very recent, like it just happened. So we were able to react on it. And I remember thinking that's when they didn't really know anything about it other than the incident. And so I remember going home and telling my mom, I was like, did you hear about this? Like, this is so awful. Can you believe this? And like the first thing she said, as many people react, is I hope they're not Muslim. And so I remember like she seemed very like desensitized to the whole situation. I was like, although I was 14, I was still like really confused. Like previously, Osama bin Laden was killed. That was a whole ordeal. Al-Qaeda was kind of like still present in the media, but I think not as much. And so for that instance to happen, and also it being in America, I was really like terrified. I was like, I cannot believe this is going on. And she did not flinch. She was just like, I really hope. And of course it turned out to be someone associated with Islam, but she was really thrown off by that. And then later on when like ISIS started popping up when I was in high school, I felt like I became more desensitized and less aware of the situation, or just like wanting the situation to not be about me or my people per se. So that's definitely also part of being in a post 9/11 world. I feel like my whole life has been a post 9/11 world. So that's really all I remember. Like in school, for 9/11, they would play like a PowerPoint, a really dramatic, like firefighters and really weird music, and then, explosions, and it was kind of like a moment of silence. And so, I would reflect on it and just think like that's really unfortunate. But I don't know what people in my class thought. They didn't really mention I think a lot of them were pretty sympathetic in terms of just like, man, that must be hard for you. Like when the Trump election happened, a lot of people like texted me and they were like, Afra, like I hope you don't think that this changes like the way we think about you. I hope your family is safe, that kind of thing, which is really nice to hear because I wasn't even thinking that. Like I wasn't thinking that my safety was in danger, but these people were like, maybe something could be happening. So it's pretty eye-opening, I would say.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about the 2016 election. By my calculation, you would have first been able to vote, so maybe that made a particular impression on you.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how that's affected you. You talk about friends who expressed concern for you that even you didn't have.
Yeah.
But have there been genuine concerns that you have had?
I wouldn't say, I actually, technically I walked through like a pro-Trump protest the day of the election. I remember like someone texted me about like if you were okay or whatnot, and I was like, why would I not be okay, you know? So I had class and went to the library, grabbed my usual bagel and coffee, and then there were like people, I remember there was a series of protests kind of, because I think because Ball State is smaller, it's not as, like I know at IU it was like huge and other places as well. But I know there was like an anti-election kind of protest, but there was a pro-Trump protest, and it was like, you know, all these guys in flannel who were sitting outside with their posters. And I remember walking through it, like, really confused as to what was happening. And then I was like, oh, my. And so that was like, but I didn't feel, like, attacked. But it's, like, interesting to think, though, like, after that happened, what were some people's opinions? Or, like, now that they know I'm Muslim, what does that mean for them? Especially when, like, the Muslim ban was very, very present. And I remember, actually, at the Indianapolis airport, there was, like, a Muslim ban protest, which my family did not partake in because they're lame. But I really wish I could have gone. But that kind of thing, it was really nice to see. And like I know on other campuses where they had more people to do things with, like they really made it a big deal, which was really cool to watch. And obviously you see on all types of political media and things about people speaking out, people like genuinely being afraid, not just for the Muslim community, but just like a lot of communities in general. It was nice. And so like being a minority, I think for anyone in any regard, is hard, and like the way people deal with it, especially like being of my generation, is different than other people's generations. Like there's a big thing I think of a lot of immigrants, like especially my parents, they think that coming to this country, they're just like facing discrimination is just kind of a part of life. Like it's like we came here, we have our freedom, we have our jobs. If someone says anything, well, that's kind of the price we pay. For I think people who are like their kids. So like me, like I was born here, so I feel just as American as anyone else. And so it's interesting though, because like when terrorist attacks happen, or like when people talk about 9/11, immigrants usually step up and have to say that they feel like their loyalty to this country is under attack. And so they don't have time to grieve because they're too busy defending themselves. And so it gets really interesting in that dynamic, because I've never felt like I had to defend myself. I felt like maybe I have to defend Muslims sometimes, where it's like, by like the whole stereotypical, it's a religion of peace, not all like terrorists or, you know, this percentage of Muslims. I've had to give that spiel before to people who really don't know anything, which is funny because like I remember one time actually, the most recent discrimination in college, it's not really discrimination against me, but I was getting a ride back from College Mentors for Kids because it was really cold on Halloween, and we saw some kid wearing a costume. It was really funny. So me and my friend, her boyfriend was giving us a ride, and we were like laughing about his costume, and then he saw a lady waiting for the bus who was wearing a hijab, and he was like, well, that's a funny costume. And I remember I was like, he probably doesn't know I'm a Muslim. It's fine. We're not going to say anything. And then his girlfriend like went off. She was like, I cannot believe you said that. Do you know Afra's a Muslim? And he was like, oh, I didn't know that. And so that was like the only thing where like, I remember, because that was very recent. It was a couple months ago. I remember like coming back to my dorm and I was like, wow, that was really weird. Because like, this is my friend. This is my friend's boyfriend. So I was like, what does she think? That was such a weird comment to make. I was like, that's not funny. So other than that, I think people are really good about it. So
you pointed to something of a generational difference, and I want to just ask you again about this. You mentioned the anti-Muslim ban at the Indianapolis airport, and you said your parents didn't go.
Yeah.
You wish you had gone.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that does say something generationally, more than just about your family?
Yeah. I think, for instance, like back to the hijab, I've actually had a couple of female friends who started wearing the hijab for religious reasons, but also for political reasons. Like, it wasn't a matter. I know some people, I've talked to people about them taking off their hijabs after so many years. Their moms saying that they should, because I know a lot of people where their mothers don't wear hijab, but they took it upon themselves to do it for themselves. Because I know plenty of people also, though, who wear the hijab because their family says they should at a certain age. And so I knew a lot of people who were like, we need to do something. We need to be more active. We can't do what our parents are doing, which is like not pretending that it's not happening, but obviously, like, you know, they don't want their jobs to be at risk. They don't want their family's safety to be at risk, which is like my dad, he can be like political at times where it's just like very anti everything. But at the same time, with like the protests, like the reasons he doesn't get involved is because he doesn't care. Like, obviously he wants change, but I think it's a little bit of cynicism in the terms of he thinks that people aren't going to change. Like, he works for the state Department of Transportation, and a lot of the people that are in charge are predominantly really strong white males. And so his job, he's like a coordinator for something. There's a lot of Indians and Muslims there who are IT, who are engineers, and they do like the main back scenes of work, but they don't have any authority. And so my dad makes it a big point to say, they're not going to listen. Don't think that our system is going to change, blah, 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 because our job is to just do like their work. So, I mean, if he has that in mind, he's not really going to think that anything is going to progress in certain ways. But it's kind of sad to see, at least for me, because like I know a lot of the youth, we get a lot of rep for like whatever, but I think the idea of change and progress and bringing awareness to things and being open-minded is really awesome to see. And I think it's nice for people to shed light on that. Like with the protest, like as much as you can say about like a protest like not causing any change, at least it brings awareness to what's going on, which is what happened at airports. So
yeah,
it's nice to see.
Speaking of movements that have really galvanized your generation, have you taken stock of, or been involved in any ways in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that I was like involved. Like I've never been to like a Black Lives Matter like protest. I wish I could be. I don't know when they go on, but like I'm definitely like a supporter. I definitely see where it's coming from. Like movements like that, I think, for instance, like with feminist movements, I think they're really like cool to see and like reflect on upon yourself. Be like, wow, like should this be happening? And especially being on a college campus, a lot of things are shed to light in terms of being inclusive, being aware of diversity. I think, especially at Ball State, I think they're really trying something new in terms of they have like a diversity week every week where they have different events. So that's good to see, especially because I think Ball State is known for not being a diverse campus. And like obviously it's diverse in certain ways, but I guess in terms of like international students, in terms of ethnic diversity, definitely that's a big thing. But they definitely shed light on different movements that are going on, I think, to make sure that people know. Like especially like, for instance, even with like gender neutral housing or bathrooms, I think that's really cool to see how that's happening. And it opens my eyes too, because I don't know a lot about certain communities and how to relate to them or how to be an advocate for them. So
you mentioned earlier an idea which has been expressed by a Pakistani American, a journalist, a young journalist, who talks about the difficulty for Muslims of being able to express a collective sense of grief with other Americans at times of tragedy because they're so concerned, in a sense, with having to defend themselves. They've seen the suspects. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about this related idea she talks about double consciousness.
Yeah. I think that's huge. A cheesy example, my favorite movie of all time is the Disney film Tarzan. And I watched it when I was 5. I actually got a noise complaint from my neighbors because I was like playing it so loud. But there's a scene where obviously Tarzan is like surrounded by gorillas. There's a scene where the gorilla dad gets mad at him and says, "You're not one of us." And so Tarzan like runs into a lake and he's like looking at his own reflection and he starts like slapping mud on himself to like look like a gorilla. And his mom comes over and she's just like, "What are you doing?" She was like, "You are a human being, we're gorillas." And I remember that really stuck with me like when I was in kindergarten because I was like, wow, I am Tarzan. I want to be white. Like he's trying to be brown, but like, we relate. And then his mom was like, "No, we both have like heartbeats." It's a great scene. And so she like, it was one of those like we're all the same kind of deals. And so I think being the double conscious thing, being aware of how different you are, because like obviously everybody's different. But to be, I think, physically different, at least for me, being physically different was such a big thing. Like if I got invited to like a pool party, I was like the only one who was wearing like board shorts, and everyone, was like wearing a tankini. And so, I didn't have to like explain myself, but I think it definitely made me, I was already a self-conscious person. So like to add that on, I was like, great. Now I have to, because of being Muslim, I have to do this, and people are going to ask me questions. And like at Sunday school, I would wear my hijab because it was like part of the uniform, long sleeves, like even in the summer. And I remember as soon as we stepped out of Sunday school, like after we left that parking lot, I would rip off that scarf. Like, that is not who I am. I'm not in Sunday school. I don't need to associate. So I literally felt like I was living a double life sometimes, where I was like, and then now I think in college, I'm more comfortable with like, we're just the same. Like the identity of being American, Muslim, Pakistani, they don't have to clash. Eventually they all kind of merge. But to get to that point, I'm still getting to that point. It was pretty hard. And so I remember like I would really, really disassociate with like certain aspects. Like, no, I don't eat Pakistani food. I'm sorry, my house smells like onions. Don't come to it. Like I'd be very insistent about that kind of thing. But I'm always definitely, I think like a lot of people, very hyper aware of how different they are. Like if I get into a classroom, I'm very aware that I'm the only brown person. And I think that happens to a lot of people. Not that it matters, but it's like, yeah, I know. Or like, for instance, like if I'm with another minority, like if it's like me and like an African American or like a Hispanic, we're kind of like, hey, we're in this together. Like we made it, But it's interesting because like, for instance, like the scholarship I have, I'm the only minority. And so it's just, not that I can't relate to other people, but obviously if I'm just very aware of it. Same with my parents, like in our neighborhood, we're like the only Muslim family. One of our neighbors is Hindu. And so, we can relate because like we're Pakistani, they're Indian. But other than that, I'm sure my parents are very aware, like at their jobs. My mom is a supervisor at a PepsiCo plant. I'm sure she wonders, or she gets conscious about like her accent. She thinks sometimes people don't take her as seriously if they can't understand her. She really can't, like her coworkers will go to bars sometimes, like after work or like for lunch. She opts out, and so she feels like she can't be like as included, or like she doesn't have that friendliness bond. Or also my parents, they definitely, when I was growing up, it was a big deal for me to hang out with non-Muslims. Like if I asked to hang out with a Muslim friend, no questions asked. Sure, you can do whatever, like come back at whatever time. If it was with a non-Muslim friend at school, it was such a big deal. Like, what are you going to do? I think it was more of them being afraid of what are they going to think. Like, we want you to be okay. I don't know if you ever heard about the show Degrassi, but it was on Nickelodeon. And basically that show was like, everybody at this high school was messed up. Like, they all did drugs. They all got pregnant. Like, this, and this. And so I'm pretty sure my parents thought that's what America was. So they were like, if we expose Afra to that, wow, what's going to happen? Mm-hmm. And so that kind of consciousness of just like my parents' weariness and then like myself, like just feeling physically different, I think definitely I was aware of. If that answers the question.
So does the term American Muslim characterize your self-understanding?
I think so. I think we talked about a lot in class, the book we read about Muslims being a Muslim in America versus being an American Muslim. And I think that distinction is interesting because a lot of people are just Muslims who happen to be in America. But I feel like I'm definitely both. I think sometimes it's funny because American Muslim can actually be used as an insult. Like to be American means you're more liberal, you're more rebellious, you're more scandalous sometimes. So like to have that label, I think sometimes people like think something of you. Like I know a lot of people, like older people, if I tell them I was born in America, they're kind of like, oh, like they must think that I'm like a kid who's like disrespectful, who like dresses this kind of way. It's interesting to see because it's like, I remember there's many people who come up to my mom, they're like, wow, you raised a good Muslim girl. And I'm like, okay. So like they're like, wow, she speaks English well. I'm like, mm-hmm. So it's interesting for them to, think that. And vice versa too, actually, like being in an American setting, sometimes I have to like feel like I have to prove that I'm American. Like, I don't know. Actually, when I was in high school, I was on the newspaper, and so we had access to everyone's records. And so I remember looking at my name, and there was like a number 6 next to it, and I scrolled over it, and it said that I had an English proficient or something like that. So like I was like, that's so weird. So I went to my guidance counselor, and I was like, hey, why does my like thing say that? Because obviously teachers, when you're a new student, they automatically see that apparently I have limited English. And so I remember I was like in honors English. I was like, I know English. And so like my guidance counselor was like, well, I just kind of assumed that English was your second language. I was like, well, you're not wrong about that. But also like, I feel like I know English better than my other language. So it was just really weird to like think that I had to like prove that I like deserved to be in this English class. That like, yeah. So that was interesting.
So Afra, I want to acknowledge that you are enrolled as a student in the Virginia B. Ball Center Seminar on Muslims in Muncie, for which I'm interviewing you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, beyond what you've said, if there are other specific ways in which this immersive experience has shifted your self-understanding of being a Muslim in America.
Yeah. I remember hearing about the course because Barb Stedman from the Honors College said that I should do it. And I remember I actually went to her office earlier that year because we talk a lot about, she knows a lot about the Muslim population. She's very involved with the Afghani population. So we related on just like wanting, she really likes to learn about other people's cultures. So we talked about that a lot and I was surprised by how much she knew. And so I remember I came to her and I was like really concerned. I was like, Barb, I was like, you told me there's a Muslim community here. There is not. And she was like, you need to meet Sister Bibi. And so that's how I started actually going to the, like making sure I went to the Islamic Center. But then she told me about this course and I was like, I was weary because I didn't know if it would actually fit into my major. I was like, and so I remember talking to my advisor and she was like, you have to do that. Like, that's so cool. And in terms of the social work field, there's not a lot of research about Muslims. I'm really interested now in actually like learning about like Muslims and mental health or like something like that. Or like how can you serve like different populations, especially because there's like a big like refugee crisis. And so I was talking to my advisor about that and she was like, honestly, like this whole department is very uninformed about like these demographics. Not that they're uninterested, but it's just like not up their alley. So she was like, you have to do this. Like that'd be so cool. And like, when is that going to happen again? And so me like finally embracing my Muslim identity, I was like, yeah, I have to do something. And I remember my RA is a Muslim. And so he was actually one of the first Muslims I met like as a student who was like not like a international PhD student. And so we talked about it a lot. And his name is Mushtaba. He used to go by Mo last year when I met him. And so the fact that he shifted from going to Mushtaba, we talked a lot about how he had his own identity crisis and how like we should be less embarrassed of who we are and how to embrace that. So it was really nice to see. And so that made me really intrigued to like be in this experience and just to be involved. It's been awesome. I'm so grateful. So yeah. And then in terms of it shaping my understanding of being Muslim, I knew obviously going into it that I was a practicing Muslim. And so to learn about the history, I think that was the biggest thing for me. Like I had no idea about the African American presence in Muncie, in America. And so like the Nation of Islam, I heard about Malcolm X, but that was kind of it. And so the fact that we did such like extensive research and the fact that it related directly to Muncie and like Amir Shabazz and that history, that was like amazing to learn about. And that really changed my perspective because I don't know any African American converts like personally. And so that was really nice to see. I think as my own practice of a Muslim, I think I'm less, like for instance, like when we go to the Islamic Center as a class, like I'm very like, I'm wearing my scarf. I don't really care. But like if you asked me 2 years ago to do that, I'd probably be like, oh, it's happening. But now I'm kind of like, yep, we're here. And I think obviously our class is very open to wanting to know about different religions, but that's also really refreshing.
So we're close to wrapping up, and I wanted to ask you, in the midst of this political and cultural environment, what is most important to you about being a young Muslim today?
I think, about being a young Muslim, I think to not forget, my mom actually, she makes a really big point to say, don't forget who you are, who we are. And I remember she used to say that a lot in high school because I was really shy growing up. And so at a certain point, I think my sophomore year, I started to like really branch out and wanting to hang out with different people like outside of school, go to Taco Bell. And she didn't like any of this. She was like, who are you becoming? She was like, you need to remember who we are. And like a lot of my American friends, my non-Muslim friends, like they could easily text their parents and be like, hey, we're going to do this and it's fine. And obviously that's like a very generational cultural thing. But my parents, like again with the double standards, like if our Muslim Pakistani friend were to ask me to do that, I'd be like, yeah, sure, of course. But my parents, they would be like, well, we don't even know who they are. And I was like, well, why don't you meet their parents? And they would say no, because they didn't know how they would think about them and vice versa. And so they didn't make it a point to branch out, but I really wanted to. I wanted to say, hey, these people don't think about us like in a negative way. We can't let them think about us in a negative way. So I would like make sure that I would like hang out with these people. My mom always said like, this is not who we are. So as a young Muslim, I think a lot of my friends, we went through that. Where now we actually joke around. Sometimes we'll say like insults in Urdu and we'll be like, we know what that means. Or like we'll talk about Pakistani cooking. But like before, I think all of us were kind of, some people, like again with American Muslim being an insult, when I was growing up at Sunday school, there was always like that scandalous Muslim, the girl who showed her ankles. And so sometimes there were girls who dated. That was a really big thing. And so for them to be more Americanized in a way, that was interesting, because then it made it seem like being a young Muslim meant that you weren't like a good Muslim. And so I think being a young Muslim like in the future just means like just remembering, like especially like with history, with like your culture, like I want to know more about my parents' history, like remembering who you are, being genuinely more interested in faith. I think for a lot of older generations, they focus more on like the practice itself in terms of tradition, like this is what we do because it's what's been done. But I know a lot of people, not necessarily who question things, but who just kind of want to know the whys and the hows. And not that we need to like revolutionize Islam, but just like, oh, like that's interesting. Are certain things interpretational? Are certain things not? What's going to happen in the future as we move forward?
Speaking of the future, what are your hopes for the future, both personally, but maybe more broadly than that?
Yeah. So personally, hope to graduate in 2 years. I'm pursuing a social work degree, so I really hope to eventually do a grad program in social work to get my master's, either in school social work or in medical social work. I don't know what yet. Eventually, I hope to get enough experience to get like a doctorate. That'd be awesome, so I could tell my dad that I'm a doctor, not a physician, but a doctor. And so that's on a personal scale. In terms of like America and Muslims, I know a lot of people talk about the fear and the ignorance. I think for me, being in the Midwest, it's less, the fear, but more like the ignorance. You'd be so surprised at how many people just like really don't know anything about, and it's not even just that, but obviously they don't take the time to know something. And so being on a college campus, I think people are definitely more educated, and especially professors, they know a lot. But sometimes if I like go to Walmart at Muncie or something, you like can pick up a vibe from people that maybe they don't want to talk to you, or if they do, it's gonna not be a good encounter. Like I think that's the thing about being a minority that you can't really explain. But like I know if I go shopping somewhere, like sometimes with my dad, like people look at him a little weird, or they assume something, or they get a little like threatened. Like I've seen people like they kind of step back because they like it's someone who's foreign. He might not be speaking English. It's weird to them. And so obviously that level of fear, I hope that can be erased or be more aware of, especially with ignorance. I think I want people to be genuinely interested in wanting to learn more, and like not to be like disproven, but just like to know, because like knowledge is so important. And I know a lot of people who just like intentionally choose to not know because it's so much easier. And so that would be my hopes.
So you've shared a number of wonderful, very specific stories and examples of things. But I'm wondering, in closing, if there's one additional event or story or one that you want to say more about from your life that expresses what it means to you to be a Muslim in America.
Yeah. Man, I have said a lot of stories. I think to be a Muslim in America, specifically, I guess, okay. So one time I was watching this BuzzFeed video, and it was like basically trying to like show stereotypes about Muslims or something like that. Like it was like, hey, I'm gay and I'm a Muslim, or like I'm like this and I'm a Muslim. So like people just kind of went back and forth, and it was people like from every spectrum of everything, right? And I remember I showed one of my friends, and I was like, look, like this one's like me. Like this girl doesn't wear a hijab, she's in college, she's just there, and she was like, yeah. And she was so like understanding of it. It was really funny. She was like, this is a great video. And I was like, yeah. And it kind of goes back to, in class, we talk a lot about humanizing people. That's what the video was. It was like Muslims are humans. But at the same time, to have someone actually like see that, it's really great. And that goes for a lot of different communities right now who are being marginalized. But I think for Muslims especially, it's the idea of people being afraid of you. And so once you can say, hey, this person is like this, by the way, they're a Muslim, like a lot of times I don't announce that I'm a Muslim. So when people figure out, it's kind of like, oh, and like they'll get interested. A lot of people are asking about like dietary habits or like prayer. And like I can tell when someone doesn't want to know or when someone's interested or if someone wants to be like offensive. It's easy to pick up. And I think a lot of people don't mean to be offensive. They just don't know how to word certain things. And they'll make a point to say that, which is really nice to hear because I would rather someone want to know than not. So I think being Muslim in America, what captures it is that people, I think, at least in college, are really open-minded and they really want to know. And so I also feel like I can be just as open-minded with them.
Thank you, Afrah. On behalf of the Virginia B. Ball Center Seminar, Muslims in Muncie, I want to thank you for sharing your story today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.